Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. This is David Shoemaker, and I'd like to welcome you to Living Thelema. This month's segment is Qabalistic Psychology Part 2, and in this segment we're going to focus on the part of the soul known as the Nephesh. So it's definitely one of those podcast series of episodes where you are going to benefit from listening to these in order and listening to the previous parts before you listen to each successive part. So please go back if you haven't and listen to Kabbalistic Psychology Part 1 first, which was kind of an introduction and an overview to the doctrines of the Kabbalistic parts of the soul in general. So as I was mentioning in the introduction last time, my aim with this series of episodes is not merely to introduce you to the traditional views of the parts of the soul and define each one and talk about their interplay a little bit, but also to stress the importance of the evolution of these parts of the soul and their interaction as it is relevant to the aeon of Horus, the new aeon. You will recall from the first episode also that, from the introduction, that my overarching theme for the series involves the ways that some of our current views of the functioning of the human psyche and spirit that are largely conditioned by the last couple thousand years of the Aeon of Osiris will necessarily need to evolve along with our actual functioning, not just our understanding of our functioning, but our actual functioning in order for humanity itself to evolve. I made the point last time that we look at our functioning as human beings in terms of the Ruach's ability to govern the Nephesh and make decisions that aren't simply based on impulse. We look at that nowadays as a pretty obvious fact of human life and human cognitive functioning, that we're not simply bound to live in a purely reactive animalistic place coming from the Nephesh, that the Ruach can exert some mastery there. So remember that the premise here is that 500 years from now, humanity will look back on our current state of understanding and wonder why we didn't understand the fullness of our neshama and our essentially our divine nature. So we'll have the same sort of bemusement looking back on humanity's evolution and self-understanding now as we do looking back, say, a couple thousand years when perhaps humanity wasn't as aware of the breadth and depth and power of its own Ruach. So, that said, let's dive into the Nephesh a little bit, so to speak. Now, the Nephesh is also known as the animal soul. So in here we have instincts, drives, primal drives, the sexual generativity, the autonomic nervous system, also the astral body, so-called. And this can include the etheric body, which is seen, as I've talked about in the astral projection episode, is seen as sort of a energetic skeleton that is more or less right beneath the surface of the physical body, whereas the astral body is the mental space itself, the field of mind. But at the level of the Nephesh, this is fairly primitive and highly symbolic and largely unconscious to the everyday functioning of the human being. The Nephesh encompasses the personal unconscious of Jung, contrasted with the collective unconscious. That is, the personal unconscious is the unconscious contents that are unique to the biography of the individual. They involve memories that are forgotten, or things that have been repressed, or things that have never been conscious, as well as things that are simply not conscious at the moment, things we have access to that are simply not in our present awareness. So that's the personal unconscious. But the Nephesh can be a conduit of collective and transpersonal symbols. And I'll say a bit more about this here because it's extremely important in terms of the path of the initiate. Um, we know that in many models, including my own, the Nephesh is placed at the sphere of Yesod on the tree of life. And as such, it has an intimate relationship to the process of initiatory advancement in the sense that before adepthood, before knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, the primary way that information or communication from the angel makes it to our conscious mind is through the field of the unconscious. That is through the intervention of symbol, and this shows up in dreams and intuitions and in our paying attention to synchronicities and such. And the symbol system that captures this really well, that relates to certain correspondences we might expect on the tree of life, would be that the Nephesh and Yesod are like the silvery or lunar consciousness that reflects the light, the solar light, the golden light of Tefereth and the HGA into our conscious minds. It's as if our conscious minds are looking down into our own unconscious, and that misty, shadowy, lunar, slightly muddled and confusing field of awareness becomes a conduit for communication from the angel. And the better we get at speaking that language, that symbolic language, that is the native tongue of the Nephesh, um, the better we are able to become conscious of the tools for attainment. In other words, the system of attainment that is in fact being communicated to us by the Holy Guardian Angel at all times if we can listen the right way. Now, the placement of the Nephesh at Yesod also shows us, through its proximity to Malkuth, the tight relationship between the Nephesh and the Guf, which is the physical body. Guph is how it's usually transliterated. So this is the mind-body connection at its most hardwired and primal. The aspects of subconsciousness which are most intimately engaged with autonomic function, such as the functions in the brainstem, that are close to the physically close and close in function to the unconscious rhythms connected with bodily rhythms like the sleep-wake cycle and the heart rate and the breathing cycle. So that part of our consciousness, which is in fact embodied in the Nephesh, is the part of us that is most in tune inherently with our bodily functioning. And this is another way that the Nephesh can serve us in our path of initiation and simply in our self-knowledge, because it has the wisdom of the body built in, kind of baked into what it is. And I think you can get a sense of how important that can be in terms of knowing ourselves and being able to work with that mind-body connection. Now, like every other aspect of consciousness, including our intellect, our emotions, the Nephesh and its intuitive nature is one source of data that the Ruach, the center of conscious, awakened awareness in the human being, can manage and master and govern the psyche. So the Ruach takes these signals, these data flows from all of the senses and the different parts of the self, and tries to integrate them into a picture that makes sense and make decisions accordingly. If we are living in our fullness, if we're living centered in the Ruach. Um, Now the Nephesh is in many ways And I know this is a cliche, but I'm going to use it anyway. Um, it's like the inner child. It's the child aspect of consciousness in the sense that it is the most primal. It is the one we start our life living through and developing, a much more primal, instinctual, um, reactive way of being. Very, very in tune with all our senses and operating in an immediate kind of cause and effect relationship without much of the reflective consciousness that we think of with the ruach. So, if we think of the nephesh as the child aspect of consciousness, and we also understand that the nephesh is tightly bound up in the body and its truths, then we can see that what has actually happened in the old aeon over the course of several thousand years of mostly Judeo Christian influenced oppression is a lot of body negativity and sex negativity, shame essentially, that's been baked into our cultural experience for most of us in the West for several thousand years. And therefore, a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of the new aeon evolution of the Nephesh has to do with what we do about this old aeon damage. In a very real way, our culture for thousands of years has abused the Nephesh as if it's an abused child. And therefore, the work we have to do moving forward to evolve in the new Aeon context, I believe, has a lot to do with healing that damage. And this brings me to a model that I'm going to lay out over the course of this and the next two episodes, which cover the Ruach and Neshama respectively. And that is a three-part sequence of transformation that, for convenience, I think fits pretty well into the idea of purification and consecration and then initiation. And in this episode, I think it's important to emphasize that what we're doing with the Nephesh is akin to purification. We are purifying the life force and the body, which is its vehicle. We are healing this Nephesh by giving it an opportunity to live and come out and play without shame, without that body negativity and sex negativity that has been so endemic. And it's much like the abused child that's finally getting a chance to realize it's not bad all the time, that it's not a source of evil and a source of shame, and it needs to be just kind of whipped until it falls into line and does what society wants. Now, the vulnerability of the Nephesh, and their meaning the vulnerability of the new child entering the world, um, has a lot of fear built into it. Typically, the child is unsure of the surroundings, is trying to get its footing. Literally, how do I get around this place? How do I move? How do I use my body? Who are these other people here? These giant parent figures in my life, and can I trust them? Um, Obviously, I'm depending on them for life and sustenance and nurturance. So, one of the ordeals of everyone's nephesh is to cultivate a right relationship with the Ruach. In other words, for us to find a way to be the best parent we can be to ourselves, the Ruach needs to parent the Nephesh in a compassionate way, in a non-judgmental way, in a way that says that to the Nephesh that its instincts, its drives, everything it is, sexuality, body and life force, all of this is divine and perfect. And so the purification, the washing away of old aeon influence here has a lot to do with letting go, cleansing us of those sorts of old aeon obsessions. Um, Now, one of the reasons that it's so important in our evolution to do this healing of the nephesh is that if we don't, as initiates or simply as human beings, if we don't uh, do this purification step in relation to old aeon baggage, then we are in a place where this vulnerable part of us is liable to reach out to unhealthy dependencies in order to feel safe. So, this is why people become overly dependent on other people um, for support or guidance when really we need to be more independent and trusting of ourselves. And also, when we have addiction issues where the aim is to numb out this fear or at least forget about it for a while through some sort of anesthetic process. Uh, so, when we cultivate the right healthy relationship between Ruach and Nefesh, then we put our trust in the right place. Um, we address our vulnerability in healthy ways, and we form this healthy dependence, interdependence, really, um, in a way that will tend not to make us uh, turn to unhealthy sources. Now, another way of thinking about why it's so important to be doing this purifying of the nefesh is that for magicians, and especially Thelemic magicians who are bringing in work with Kundalini and with the concept of sexual magic and knowing that there is an evolutionary power bound up in the life force itself. If we are suffering from neuroses of the nefesh, in other words, this sex and body negativity and shame that I was talking about, that's going to muddy the waters of every bit of magic we do. If we are walking into our temple to perform a ritual and there is a part of our brain that is feeling we are somehow dirty and evil, that our bodies are evil or are corrupt in some way, that there's, I guess it's one way of putting it would be that we saw this sort of original sin neurosis from the old aeon. If we're bringing that into the temple, then that will corrupt and corrode our magic. So, what we are essentially doing in building this right relationship to the nefesh and right understanding of it is that we're recognizing the inherent power of this life force. We are by purifying it and coming into a wholesome relationship with it, making its full power available without being tainted by these cultural accretions, shame and guilt, and so on. And we then can utilize it in a fully empowered way. Now, there's one more very important dynamic with the Nephesh that I want to discuss today, and that relates to some of the religious accretions around the treatment of the Nephesh that are characteristic of the old Aeon. Namely, the idea that we are essentially going to be victimized by the naughty, basic sexuality of our Nephesh unless we get help from an exterior god, unless we turn to some sort of concept of God on a cloud, that is going to save us from ourselves. And this is one of the most poisonous aspects, I think, of religious culture of the past couple thousand years in the West. And it is one that this purification process is hopefully going to be effective in overturning for us. The idea that we, in fact, don't need a savior, most especially and emphatically, we don't need a savior that somehow is going to protect us from ourselves because we are in ourselves divine and complete. So I think you'll see as we continue to talk about this model extended to the other parts of the soul, the way this viewpoint evolves as well, the way that we can see what a new aeon way of looking at the divinity of the whole human and all its parts can evolve as well. So this has been an overview of the Nephesh, and I hope that it's fitting in as a building block into your understanding of Kabbalistic psychology itself, but also this model of human evolution that we're building up here based on the Kabbalistic parts of the soul. So, as always, if you have comments or questions, direct them to me at david@livingthelema.com. See resources at livingthelema.com as well. And for more information on various avenues of training, you can contact the AA at onestarinsight.org and the Temple of the Silver Star at totss.org. Thanks very much for listening. Love is the law. Love under will.